Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at medcomsnetworking.com, information services, resources for people working in and around the global medcoms market, by which I mean in medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and so on. You'll find all sorts of activities going on at medcomsnetworking.com. One of the things that we're doing at the moment are these webinars, which is great because we can get an international panel and audience involved in this. And what we're doing is we're recording the webinars and we're putting them all on NetworkPharma TV, where there's now hundreds of these sorts of videos. So if you're interested in any of this, go and have an explore of those sites. Now, what I'm actually on a bit of a soapbox today. Today's topic is about sort of metrics, setting goals, measuring results in medcoms. I'm going to try not to get too excited, but I think it's a really important question that we should address from time to time. Is what we're doing actually of any use to anybody? And if we aren't asking that question, do we know? And if we are asking questions, are we asking the right questions? Are we understanding the information that comes back? And particularly in the digital world, there's a tendency to throw numbers around and just think numbers mean something. And I'm very keen that we think a little bit about it all. So I'm absolutely delighted with the panel that I've managed to get together today. Huge thank you. They're going to introduce themselves in a moment, but I mean, huge thank you to all of you. Liz, James Harper, James Hadfield. We're going to have to distinguish between you two. And Steve, thank you so much for coming in. You're coming in from Australia. Liz from is it Zurich, Switzerland? Anyway, isn't it? It's Zurich, isn't it? Liz? James from the UK. Great to have you all on board. I know you've all got real expertise in this area and thoughts to share. One of the things I will say to the audience is please join in. Okay, you've got a chat box, you've got a Q&A box. Send your text comments in. Ask your questions. Challenge us. Comment, observations. Disagree with us. Let's have a lively discussion for 40 minutes or so. So, on that note, I'm going to ask Liz to kick us off, a little bit of introduction about herself, but also set the scene a little bit for what we're going to talk about today. So Liz, you're on first, go.
Thank you, Peter. So I am Liz Stutz. I'm the Scientific Services Director at Medicalwriters.com. I'm based in Zurich. We also have offices in New York. We have a team of about 50 medical writers and medical illustrators, and we work with larger pharma clients in delivering kind of, well, the full range of medical communications solutions, but focusing on medical affairs. I want to set the scene. This webinar came from a discussion that I had with Peter some time ago, and what we started talking about was the challenges ahead of us in terms of metrics and what we measure. So I may be showing my age here, and it pains me to say this, and I imagine that I might be way off with the rest of you, but do you remember at school or at uni, probably at uni, when the professor or the lecturer rolled in the OHP and they got their shiny acetate out and their little pens and they started drawing or writing notes? And there came to a point in most of our careers where the last times you saw that, you were like, what are you doing? Have you heard of PowerPoint? Have you heard of, like, computer? And I think we've come to a similar juncture now in medcoms as well, where there's a clear previous, and now thanks to COVID to some extent, there's going to be the way that things are going increasingly. I think COVID accelerated the shift towards digital. And I think when clients now ask us for very traditional deliverables, all of us feel our heart kind of sink into our boots, because you have all this opportunity to provide deliverables that are exciting and new, and yet they keep going back to the same old pair of slippers. And the thing that stops us pushing forward faster is often that clients are understandably nervous about taking this leap of faith into something that they're not sure how it will land with their client, with their markets, with their internal stakeholders, with the wider world, with their HCPs. And this is particularly true in medical affairs, because obviously there are kind of compliance and cost and shiny issues that make people uncomfortable. So as medcoms professionals, we spend a lot of time trying to convince them that this is the way forward, that this does work, and that we know this works, and that based on adult education principles and things that apply from other industries, we know what we're doing, and that this is a good thing to do. And they need to be able to justify it not just to themselves, but also to their stakeholders, to their management teams, to their internal teams, and to their procurement teams, that this is a valuable investment and that it has a good return and there's added value to what they're planning to do. And they want numbers. They want actual concrete data to be able to present to them. And so do we, actually, because it'd be really helpful for us to be able to sell these deliverables if we could actually put something behind it. So what would those numbers look like, and what are the markers that we should be looking for? In medical affairs particularly, but also generally in medcoms, it's sometimes quite hard to show the added value because the lag phase is quite long, especially when you're talking about a transfer of knowledge or an educational outcome, a clinical change of behaviour. So it's very hard to produce rapid turnaround markers and metrics that will help them to see that things are working. But then thinking about it, and if we're honest with ourselves, I think all of us are slightly guilty of probably using the wrong markers in the past. So nothing really changes if we don't take a good stand on this now and start thinking purpose-led, what do we actually need to show, and basing it on integral markers based on the strategy and the objectives of what we're trying to achieve, rather than tagging them on at the end as an afterthought of like, how is this actually landing? So we've always had quite a lot of quantitative data. We can measure things like bums on seats, like Peter said, at symposia. We can measure click-throughs. We can measure kind of how people interact with content on a superficial level, but this is all it's very much less than half of the story, because without the context and without the qualitative data behind that, it doesn't really mean much. The cool thing is that as we do embark on a more digital world, we have a much greater ability to embed and integrate metrics and measurements into the content that we create and the deliverables that we produce. So we don't really have an excuse anymore. That's also the other thing. We need to really bolt this down now. And I think we as medcoms professionals can lead the way in encouraging the right measurements, and not just as a pat on the back to ourselves, but also as a feedback loop to make sure that what we're doing has practical meaning. And at this point, I think I'm going to hand over now to James to talk about the next part of this journey.
That's it. I was just going to interject and say thank you very much, Liz. And I think the point I want to keep making is that what we're talking about is metrics and measuring, and it's not just about digital. It's like we should have been doing a lot of this stuff before. And I think we, as you say, we've all been a bit guilty. You know, have we got lots of bums on seats sort of thing? That's okay. It's been successful. But what does it actually mean? So, but the digital world is interesting because it gives us so much more opportunity to measure. And James Hadfield, you were going to pick up on that and go a little bit further about what you're doing at Lucid, yeah?
Yeah, hi everyone. James Hadfield from Lucid here. Yeah, I guess kind of picking up on what Liz said, and actually kind of what you said at the start, Peter, that, you know, there are so many different levels that we can be tracking metrics on. And if you kind of think about, we're taking kind of a leaf out of the Moore's outcome model for healthcare interventions. You know, you can start off at a very, you know, the level one, the kind of basics is bums on seats, delegate count, things like site traffic, video views, click-through rates, just participation. And as you start going up there, you can start thinking about, well, okay, are they satisfied with what are they getting? Are they getting what they need? You know, can you track a net promoter score from a meeting, or can you recommend a friend or a colleague? Did it meet your expectations? And then building on that, you know, can you demonstrate knowledge, self-assessment, self-awareness, that type of thing? Building on that again, does that translate into competence, kind of skills around a particular area in an educational setting? But that's kind of all at the educational setting itself. You kind of really want to translate, you know, we talk about behavior, right? We want to translate it to performance behavior, practical and demonstrable to change in clinical behavior or other behavior that, you know, maybe you can track at a later date. Maybe if you've got some form of kind of tracking via, I don't know, via email or via reps or MSLs or that type of thing, you know, is there a way to have that follow up and actually check the impact you've had at a later date? And then really kind of what we're looking to achieve with this behavior change ultimately is to transform patient health and community health and, you know, this real top level of the pyramid. But as you get higher up the pyramid, it gets harder and harder to track, to measure, to demonstrate, and even to ascribe that, you know, your specific intervention was the thing that caused that change. So I do think it's important to kind of consider higher up the pyramid. But I also think it's very important to kind of look down at the bottom and the value that brings. You know, it's vital to have a strategic vision and North Star that might be around community health or patient outcomes, or, you know, a change in the specific behavior among a kind of a specific persona that we're looking to develop, or an audience, or a type of doctor, or, you know, whatever it might be. But actually the those day-to-day metrics towards the bottom that I described, things like, are you reaching the right patients in the first place? Are they happy with the engagement that they're having, whether that be digital or non-digital? They kind of are just as important to build the story, because if you don't reach people and if you don't engage them, you can't achieve that ultimate behavior change. I think as we've digitalized and as the pandemic's had its effect in terms of the completely turning the kind of, I guess, our ability to have those meetings at congresses or kind of educational face-to-face meetings, actually that's one of the biggest challenges, is are we reaching the people we need to? Are we engaging the people we need to? And so we shouldn't forget those, I guess, the basics, because they're really, really important. So I guess kind of to sum up what I'm saying is it's important to have a good goal hierarchy. And Angela Duckworth actually talks about that. It's in her work Grit, around Grit. It's important to have like a clear pyramid where you have these top level goals. What are you trying to achieve from a kind of population basis or behavior change basis? But all of your lower goals need to kind of add up to that. And too often, maybe in brand planning, you might talk about those top level goals. In implementation, there might be some very good tracking of some of these metrics, but too often than not, there isn't the structure that joins it all together. And I think that's the thinking that we really need to be driving more as medcoms professionals.
Fantastic, thanks, James. And just to Bethany's just asked for clarification, the model you're talking about, the pyramid model, Don Moore's pyramid, it's something like 7 levels of outcomes. I set up the European CME Forum, and it was fascinating actually, because in CME, continuing medical education circles, they're very fixated by Don's pyramid, which starts at the, were there people in the meeting room at all? And it goes up through, did you ask them whether they learned anything? And it goes up through, did you go and change your behavior? And it goes up through, was there any patient? And it gets harder and harder as you go up. But there's also one of the things I observed, that they were doing it, which was interesting, but also that then became a fixation on, well, if we're not achieving level 1, what's the point, sort of thing, which is enormously difficult to go out there and really prove change in practice. But at least if you can push us up the pyramid and start asking some questions of the people that you're engaging with, then I think it's really, really important. Steve, I'm going to bring you in next, because and specifically, Steve, you've done some work which you published, and I've applauded, because I just, I think it's important that we in MedComms publish a bit more of our stuff, as it were, yeah. And you published some work you'd done with podcasting, and I was particularly interested in the discussion that you included in that about the metrics. And so you just pick that one up and take that as a project. What were you trying to do, and how were you measuring, and what were the challenges involved with that specific project? Steve, over to you.
Okay. So thank you, Peter, and also thank you for the opportunity to be part of this. So for those of you who don't know me, so my name's Stephen Inglis. I'm Communications Director at Oxford PharmaGenesis in our Melbourne office. So I came back to Melbourne in 2017 after being in the UK for several years. And when I came back to Melbourne, one of the first things I started doing was developing a podcast series for a new client in Australia. And I'd never made a podcast before, and didn't really have a lot of exposure to digital forms of education. I was basically a manuscript writer before that. So a bit of a learning curve. And I suppose, digital education is something that's just been gradually progressing in its, popularity and how it's used over the last few years, obviously. And COVID's, as other people have said, has accelerated things a lot. But yeah, I suppose I can talk a bit about everyday practicalities around metrics, and with our podcasts experience. So relatively basic metrics, how many people do you get to sign up for your podcast series, for example, and then how many of those people go on to listen to the podcasts, how many people click play on a podcast, how long do people then go and listen for to an individual episode? Do they listen to the whole thing? So how long are they engaged for? These are all the basic things that you would expect to collect. I suppose depending on where you're hosting your content, it may not always be that easy to what you think might be relatively simple things. I mean, if you haven't actually got a tool that is hosting your content that was designed up front to measure particular things or get that granular data, always, it's not always that easy to get everything that a client might ask you for. Is one of the challenges that we've faced, they might get, quite specific questions about, well, okay, it's great to see we've got this many people, but I'd like to see more people, but are they the right people?
Yeah.
Are they actually my target audience? Can you delve deeper into who are these people that are listening to our content? I want to know, are they a nurse, or are they a pharmacist, or are they a specialist, or are they a GP? So your platform may not have necessarily been designed to collect that level of detail, and you might actually have to go back and look through the raw data and with some, either manually or by coding, to find some of this information. And then there's all these, there's privacy considerations around that. How are you actually going to do it? Where's the data stored? So these are some of the challenges you actually can face, or that we have faced. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in development of digital technology for all this stuff. I'm sure there might be other people on this panel who can talk more around that, and there's obviously other people in our company, Oxford PharmaGenesis, who have a lot of that expertise as well. But so I guess, we talk around some of the challenges around handling the metrics and presenting the metrics to on these podcasts in this publication. So I guess that's one side of the story. I think the other part of the story that we talk a bit about in our paper is around, so it is around the audience recruitment. So getting a good number of people to come and listen or access your content, setting realistic expectations about, well, if you're putting that content out there for a certain market, do you actually know how many relevant healthcare professionals are in that market that you may want to access this content? And if you do know that number, then can you set a reasonable proportion that you might be trying to get to actually come and listen? And that number may not actually be a huge number, depending on the therapy area, the country, and your client might want a much bigger number to show return on investment. So these are some of the challenges that we've faced. And I actually think, I agree digital technology is great for healthcare professionals, but there are also barriers, in my view, to solid uptake of digital education, because there are regulatory requirements about who can access content in different countries. So a lot of stuff, most stuff is not publicly available. You have to verify people, they have to create accounts, they have to make passwords. Aren't people tired of signing up for accounts and making passwords all the time? I think password fatigue, and that's a concept that we came up with in our article. I see that as a challenge in this space, is getting people to, it could be limiting to getting people to come, more people to come and access your content. So sorry, yeah,
Steve, I'm just going to jump in quickly, and I'm just trying to remember, sorry, but clarify for us, the podcast that you've done, Are they behind some sort of a wall, as it were, so that the HCPs have to sign up to access your podcast? They're not freely available, are they?
That's correct.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the point you're
depending on,
making, sorry, I think the point you're making
yeah,
is really, really important, and putting those gateways in place to get that information about the is in itself a huge barrier. You know, 90% of people don't go past internet statistics are great, aren't they? You just spout this stuff. But, you know, in my experience, a lot of people will not go through the simplest of gateways to access something because they can't be bothered. And that rapidly rises if you put a price on or something else like that. So I think this is really important. You know, if you can measure stuff, but, you know, are you measuring just electronic activity? Are you measuring real people? And what does that mean? Yeah. But can we just lead into James Harper, who has got real expertise in this area and digital and so on. And James, can you pick that up and talk about those sorts of challenges?
Sure, I'd love to. So again, for those that don't know me, James Harper, I'm the founder of 28B. We basically inspire brand and medical teams to use Viva and other technologies like that better to enable their medical and brand field teams, so commercial field teams. So we have a lot to do with data. I think it's the sort of the underutilized part, and that's not just in medical and medcoms, but also in commercial. I think the problem we see a lot is those who are not willing to live by the sword and die by the sword. I think our biggest challenge is everyone gives it lip service. Yeah, we'd love to know it, but actually I'm only in this job for 2 years. Do I really want to know that 250 grand I spent on the campaign was a massive flop? I kind of just pretend that it's great and move on. If I'm being totally transparent, I think, you know, there's it's given lip service and it's not actually really at the heart of what we do yet. But it's a long way off, and that's even in commercial where it's maybe been happening for longer. And yet, it's not really so I know this webinar is about measuring the performance of your programs, etc. But data is so much more than that. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of other things before because they kind of go hand in hand, right? So data can also generate insights into our customers and forgive me, I'm going to use the word customer, stakeholders, key opinion leaders, the clinicians. And we know that that's a big role for field medical teams. So, you know, as you're designing insights and analytics into your content, it can also be telling us about the behaviors of customers, not just in terms of the success of the campaigns, but also the insights that will help us do better in the future and in turn help our commercial colleagues when it comes to the commercialization of that brand. Can also be used to better build relationships with those stakeholders and key opinion leaders. And I'll give you the most commercial example of how this happens with data at the moment. And it's one that everyone uses. It's your Amazon homepage, right? If you went back to your Amazon homepage each time and it started from fresh each time, and you had to do, you know, you had to learn you all over again just for that one session. And the next time you came back, it was blank. That's what we do with our clinicians at the moment for most of our interactions with them is, you know, the rep or the field medical will come along, and of course they know what they talked about last time, but the technology just starts from fresh. And it's slightly different with medical education. Obviously, you can log in and you've got your progress is saved, etc. But there's data can help us build conversations over time with our stakeholders and move them along the adoption ladder if I was in commercial world, or the educational ladder if we're talking about that. And again, to speak to James Hadfield, who's down there for me, point, you know, the ultimate goal is behavioral change. Wherever you are in the spectrum from commercial to medical, at the end of the day, we want our KOLs to speak for us. We want our stakeholders to pitch for it on a formulary. We want our GPs to prescribe. And that is where data gets really, really difficult. You've all identified it. And we end up quite often with proxy measures for that. So in terms of your pyramid, which I hadn't come across, by the way, I was Googled it while you're talking. That's amazing. I'm going to steal that for sure. So I think it is really important to consider that. So lots to talk about what's already been introduced, but fundamentally for me, it's about planning early. So I'm here to talk about technology, right? And I'm almost redundant here because of course the technology can do it, right? It's almost built to do it. Stephen's point's very valid. Check first, because you know, you don't want to promise analytics and find out that you haven't got a way to categorize the people who've registered, and you actually have one homologous group of attendees, and it's almost meaningless, right? So but the technology usually can do it, but it's definitely worth checking. But it's planning ahead. What is it that what does success look like? I think it was Stephen again that said, you know, how many doctors are we talking about as a success? Like what percentage of, you know, when we say we had 20% of, or we had this number, what does that represent in terms of the audience we were going after? And I'm a judge on various awards, and some of those awards are effectiveness awards. And very key to that is metrics, right? And we'll see the metric that said, we reached 2,000 doctors globally. Like, of what? Of whom? What percent? Like, what does that even mean? In rare diseases, that might be a triumph. In cardiology, it would be questionable, right? So, and there's nothing worse than doing content and then saying, what can we learn from it? Right? It's much better to go, what do we want to learn? Obviously, you've got some content that goes out, but before you start to structure it, before you start to create it, is what do we want to learn from this? And I'll go back to that. It's not just in terms of how well we did, but what we can learn about our customers, our market, what we can do to build that relationship. And it goes in early, right early in that planning. And that includes technology assessment. What's the right platform, but also what's that content look like to make it happen. And just to comment on your loss of people when you're registering, even a click is a 50% loss. But what I challenge you back is, what's the alternative? Send them it in the mail. So like it's a bit like when you're dealing with compliance, right? And they go, you know, this new compliance solution still got holes, but it's better than the previous version, right? So digital is still an improvement, but it is also a challenge about how we get them on. And controversially, the best way to do that is single sign-on, right? We should be coming together as an industry, and we should be enabling a clinician to log on to it with a single username that gives them access to all the content from all the pharma companies. You know, the fact they have to log in for different companies, for different agencies even, and multiple login, no one likes that stuff. So really, let's take a challenge on as our industry, bring everyone together and get a single sign-on for our clinicians and make their life easier. And I bet you'd see that uptake rocket, but of course, that's not likely to happen.
Well, as speaking of someone who's been around in this business for quite some time, there have been various attempts to do that, haven't there? That's been part of the idea behind some of the doctor platforms, for instance. You know,
yep.
If everybody's on this, you know, and there was various gateway type technologies that said exactly that. Get the doctor to sign up to this one, and then everyone else licenses our technology, and suddenly magically you can all get through, and that's very, very difficult in practice, if not impossible.
At least the big, sorry, just to say, at least the big companies have taken this on, and you now have, you know, single educational and engagement portals for Pfizer and AZ and all the rest of it, but it's still not ideal when it's quite fractured as a login process.
Exactly, and I think, I mean, again, it's about understanding what you're trying to do. You know, I am very keen on the idea that you ask yourself the question, does somebody really need to log in to get this? Yeah, I mean, I know there might be compliance issues and all the rest of it with HCPs, but, you know, let's keep this discussion reasonably broad and go, for some audiences, for some things you're trying to deliver, it's anybody can access it. So then it becomes a marketeer's, you know, we all know marketeers who go, well, if someone's going to get this, they're going to give me a lot of information to begin with. I want their date of birth, and I want their this, and I want their that. And apart from the GDPR type issues and all the rest of it, why would you do that? And, you know, so again, it's more complicated than any of this. It's complicated, but you need to think about your project, what you want to do, and how you're going to deliver it, and when you need that information.
Well, you've introduced a direct conflict for this presentation, for this discussion, right? Which is if we, well, yeah, because this is how do we measure the success of our, how do we measure the success of our campaigns, and that requires data, and you have to get data by people at least attending, and then unless they register or give you some information, then that data is, you know, it starts to become weaker and weaker. So there's this balance, right? Which is the more information we get about the people attending, the more insights we have about improving our content, measuring success, gaining insights. But the more people we might lose as they start to feel that's more than I want to give you. And you know, that's where A/B testing and stuff over time would be ideal to do. But we all know that A/B testing in a world of compliance is a real challenge where, you know, we have to have almost like an end product before we can release it.
Right. Yeah.
So it's also a challenge because we're not. It's, you know, in terms of when we're communicating to, I don't know, patient world or consumer world where there's very, very big data, you know, the likes of Amazon, there'll be very, very easy to do A/B testing. Usually we have a, you know, a smaller population, as you say, in cardiology, it might be a bigger population, but actually in rare diseases, it might be a very, very small population. So again, it's harder because we don't generate the same level of data to make kind of critical comparisons or significant comparisons.
Which is even more important to get almost customer level data, right, with their permission. And in a way, when you've got a small data sample, it becomes more interesting about the individual. You know, if you're talking about key opinion leaders, you want to know about that individual key opinion leader, not about the group that they belong to. When you've got more and more customers, that's where you use segmentation, as in, I can't afford to know about every individual customer, but I do want to know about early adopters, or I do want to know about confident prescribers, or, you know, and you start to use those categories, but you have to get some information in order to categorize those people to make the data useful. And it is, and Peter, you're absolutely right, it's a balance. The more we want, the less we'll get in terms of people registering. Ideally, you know, you get them in once with that information, and then there's lots of content for them over time, and then the sign on simple, and they don't have to do it again, and we can gather that data.
And it's challenging to join that up, right? Because you're kind of thinking, you know, there's like a, you know, there's the Viva world where that might be kind of interactions between, you know, reps or MSLs, but then the marketing team might be running a webinar over here, the medical team might be having a website over here, and then actually, you know, to join all of those different bits up, they're all delivered in silos, probably with different agencies, different individuals. And actually, one of the challenges is how do we join that up, and how do we not just measure, or not just kind of look at the metrics on that individual tactic level, but actually have a dashboard that kind of assesses the whole journey. And that, you know, that's the dream, right?
Well, Peter asked if, you know, practical examples of what's going on. I can show you. We're about to publish a white paper on it with a global rare diseases company that's a dashboard for the field teams, both medical and commercial, and they've been very good at both getting permissions from their clinicians to do this, but basically any clinician logging onto their education site, or signing up to a patient support program, or signing a patient up for that, or when they visit a website and they download how to prescribe, etc. All of that is being gathered in a data lake. It's then being put into Viva CRM, and then we're reading it through a dashboard. So when the field team look at their dashboard, they can see any changes in terms of what the clinicians have done. And this is where we're talking about customer insights rather than measuring success, but you can follow the principles of it. But that took a huge effort, right? And you can imagine that never happening in any larger company where there's so many moving parts. It can only really happen in a more agile, you know, maybe more modern thinking, recent startup kind of rare diseases space. But it's hugely effective for the field teams.
Can I just jump in? A couple of quick points, answering a couple of questions that came in, or points that have come in. This video will be recorded and put on YouTube. If you're watching the video later on, you might be looking at it in various places, but if nothing else, you can go back to the YouTube page at its origination, and I'll include the references there for things like Steve's paper and the Moore's pyramid and so on. And always, if you've got questions from these, you know, just email us. LinkedIn is a good way of contacting us. We'll all help if we're mentioning things that we're not quite clarifying. So that was point number one. The other point has gone straight out of my head, so we'll ignore it, except to say to the audience, you know, if you do want to join in with this, please use the text boxes, and we'll happily pick it up and weave it into the conversation. Oh, that was the other point. Someone corrected me slightly offline. When I mentioned Moore, let's be clear on this, Moore's pyramid starts at the bottom at 1 and goes to the top. And I think I said something like there's a tendency to focus on level 1, the hardest. Well, actually, that was completely the wrong way around. Level 1's the easiest. That's the bums on seat level. So the point is, people start to fixate on achieving the almost impossible at the top. So I got that wrong. Sorry about that. So thank you for pointing that out. Let's dwell on a couple of specific examples for what it's worth. Okay. And as I say, please, in the audience, please put some questions in it. But let's take a meeting. Let's take an event. I got a bit excitable recently, and again, I'll put this in the references. The paper that was published, I think it was around about July, August time, talking about the European Cardiology meeting in 2020, when it was made free of charge. And it's a fascinating paper. If you haven't seen it, and I'll put the reference in, it's a fascinating paper in terms of it's being very open and it's talking about metrics. But what they do, I think, get it slightly wrong in terms of they talk about the registrations for the meeting went through the roof compared with the previous face-to-face. And you have to dig a bit to see that the total number of registrations is not the total number of people who came in at any one time, and so on. So I don't want to get overly excited about this, but you know, we had 180 people sign up today. I knew we'd have half as many people turn up, and we probably have about that. And I don't know whether all those people are paying any attention to what we're talking about, or just going off and doing their emails sort of thing. What have you got any observations on this? And Liz, let's start with you. And what I'm interested in is, and I don't think we've quite addressed this yet, is when you're putting your projects together, how much of the drive to understand this is coming from a client end as opposed to your end? I know we all work in partnership, but I'm just intrigued how much the clients are going, we need to measure and so on. Do you see what I mean? And let's just take a meeting as an example. What sort of discussions do you have around that? Do you see what I mean?
So I think I would say in the pitching phases, there's a lot of interest in how you're planning to measure and how you're planning to plan according to the measurements you want to make. It seems to be quite kind of a deciding factor in how an agency is selected. Sometimes I think it's more they want to see that you're thinking about it rather than them actually using or knowing what they're going to do with that information. It's more of a kind of like litmus test of whether you're just chucking your hat in the ring or not. And I think for us as an agency, we've actually done some independent research and published, in fact, some independent research on what HCPs need from medical communications, how they engage with content, looking at, for example, the sheer volume of data and of papers that they would theoretically need to read in a set period to actually be considered to be continuing their expertise in an area. And then we also have done some research on how at meetings particularly HCPs prefer to be engaged. And I think somebody mentioned in the chat, or I can't find it now, something about market research about new modalities of delivering information. And we do have data from a study that our CEO did actually and published, I think it was a few years ago now, but and it was in neurologists particularly. But it was quite interesting that even back then, and this is pre-COVID by quite some time, there was a huge consensus that eliminating slide decks would be kind of good, and that restricting the time of presentations would be good, and that moving towards more free text presentations and fireside chats and interactive content would be massively appreciated. So yes, there is data, but I think on a massive scale, not necessarily. And I think that would be something really interesting, because that, though clients are not asking for that kind of data, it helps us then when we're pitching and when we're talking to clients to be able to give them that information up front to show that we've done the research and we've thought about it. And this is not just a, hey, we can make more money if we sell you this, rather than that. Right. So yeah, that would be my answer.
Okay, but the slight throwaway comment you put in there was, you know, whether the client does anything with that data, sort of thing. They like to see you think about it, but do they do anything with the data? Which of course is the sort of thing I would go, I don't think they do very much. Or at least
well, and precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is so, I read something yesterday, I think it was in the MAPS white paper about metrics in medical affairs, but they talk about it being not points of trivia, because this is often what these metrics are used as. It's kind of like a way to pat yourself on the back or go, oh yeah, this happened and we got this return on it, but nothing happens with it. It's not a way of going, and because of that, we should therefore think about what we do next time, or we should implement this back and we should use it as a feedback loop and make sure that we've identified the weak points and bring them back in for the next iteration or so. And especially with meetings, that's critical, because what is the point? If you don't know what you're going to do with the data, what is the point of asking people these questions if it's then just... Yeah. Okay.
And then James Harper, I'll bring you in a moment, because that's exactly a point that you would be making, isn't it? But James Hadfield, let's bring you. I mean, again, just talking on this level of how much are the clients pushing for this, and are they then actually doing anything, or is it a tick? And let's be just open here. We don't have to name names, but you know, is it just a tick box exercise? Do you find, or where's the pressure coming to measure?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to what I said earlier and what Liz kind of said as well, that there's a pressure at the start when you're doing the planning to kind of think about it. We're tracking stuff, but the big work that I think needs to be done more consistently is joining it all together. So laddering up the metrics that we're capturing, and then thinking, okay, so how do these address what, you know, our CSFs for the program are, and making sure that there is a rigor in place to be testing that as you're going along. And kind of on the note, you know, that we've all said, actually, that agile thing is so important. I think there is a tendency to kind of think, well, we're tracking it, so A, we can get funding for the program the next year, B, we can get our client, or the client can get that good big promotion, C, we're trying to do it so we can win that Communique award. And, you know, all without trying to be too cynical about it, I think the point is, and we've all said it, that the most valuable thing is actually not to know when you're doing great, it's to know when you're doing badly. Because if you know you're doing badly, you're not reaching people into this webinar. why are you spending so much money creating loads of new content for the webinar series where you're not getting people in? You should be reinvesting the effort into getting people to it. Then, because we're all proud about trying to achieve something, making meaningful change, and if haven't got this growth mentality about trying to pick out where the challenges are, we're not going to be achieving that. So that's that's the kind of discussion we're having with clients, is to counsel them to kind of make sure they're asking the right questions for the right reasons, and helping them to think of things from a broader program perspective, not just in a single deliverable, and not just about content. It's around how does that content resonate, and how does it kind of make the change that we want it to.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Steve, and again to pin you down slightly, because you're the one that's published some results there. How would the expectations on all sides of that sort of project in terms of putting those podcasts out? Did anyone in that scenario go, we haven't got 100 million downloads, so therefore it's rubbish? Or were people understanding of the context of this, and were the numbers making sense or not? Can you give us a flavour of those sorts of discussions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we got a bit of everything, actually. I think because we've worked with a few different people on this, and not just in Australia as well, actually. We've been doing this work in the UK and in some European countries as well. I think we're in the early days. I think we got people didn't really understand. I think that perhaps a lot of the more sort of senior director people overseeing what's going on inside companies might be questioning, are we getting enough people listening to this content? How do we show that it's valuable? But I think there was our client. She batted hard for it because she believed in it, and she believed that this was the future. She still does believe. She might even be listening to this now. She's a strong advocate for podcasts and digital medical education and innovation. She batted for this. She believed in it, and she got it over the line, and she got more funding to continue in, even though perhaps the initial numbers over the first year were not that strong. So that's one example, and then but perhaps some of the other people around her colleagues who gave it a try in future years, then they were sort of asking a few questions around, oh well, we'd like to see a few more people, or I'd like to know who they are, and we weren't always able to deliver that level of detail on, because we developed assets for hosting podcasts that were designed to be GDPR compliant, for example, which meant that a lot of the raw data was not easily accessible or anonymized to a way that you couldn't actually find out who was listening to it. Yeah, and this was a requirement at the time, and but it actually created challenges for the wishes of some other people, some of the other clients in that group.
Okay, I'm gonna bring James Harper in there. I mean, I think this is I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, and we haven't got a lot of time. But this, people like big numbers, and to come back to a point that you said was you challenged me on slightly. If you let something be freely available out there, you still get metrics, and there are people who will simply go, well, we've had a hit rate of this or something, which means nothing, but you can still get numbers, and so you can still talk numbers, and if it's a big number, it can still sound impressive. So James, again, just try and pick up on that a little bit from your point of view in terms of managing expectations is the bit I'm interested in, I suppose, there.
Well, I really like what Liz said, right? A lot of the time it's vanity stuff, and it's used so that we can, when we do a pitch, we can say, well, back in the day when I was at MedComms, could do a pitch, say, look how good we were at this meeting, and there's just not nuances to that data that says whether it's really successful. And you can always, let's be frank, massage data to make it look how we want it to look. And our clients again, back in the day, may want to be using that for their own purposes, etc. Does it really tell us about the success of that? So it's an important first point, right? Because like bums on seats tell you almost nothing, especially if it's at a satellite meeting at a congress. Okay, we've done some great advertising, they're there. It tells you something. What I like about what Stephen's talking about, and in fact, Daniel Garlick has also mentioned this, it's about development over time, right? So it's the impatience with someone about something working. And one-off meetings, of course, you have to learn everything you can there. But medical education that's ongoing, or a podcast series, podcasts are a prime example of something that builds over time. There are also really interesting examples of, even without nuances to the data, it's still really insightful because they can just stop listening, right? It's more difficult to walk out of a meeting in the middle of a presentation, right? You know, the people see you and you're maybe there with your colleagues and all the rest of it, but there's nothing to stop you stopping listening to a podcast and then not coming back to the series. There's everything about hitting that subscribe button. There's something that's brought you in to do it, depending on what your platform you're using. It may be a website we have to come back in, but if it was actually general public through the Apple Podcast, etc., those sort of stats can be powerful even without the nuance or the more granular insights about custom type and customer insights. So it is all I had to put this, data's data. James made this point earlier. It's like it's planning it up front. What are your CSFs? What are your KPIs? What's your total audience? What's your expectation? What's a genuine measure of success? What's a stretch goal? And lay that out all at the beginning. And the more thought and planning you give it, the more invested in the outcome the people of the project are, and therefore maybe they will actually listen and act upon it. If it's just like we have these measures and they're not really insightful and they've come out, great, I can use them to promote this internally, or I can use it to promote it with other clients. But just like we do, I trot this out all the time, right? Stakeholder management, right? We do it all the time with our external customers and clinicians. We take the trialists to talk to key opinion leaders, we take the key opinion leaders to talk to secondary. We have this cascade of investment in this messaging and this science, in this publication, in these guidelines. And we need to do that internally with our clients in the pharma industry as well, is building that excitement and interest and investment in the data so that when we do present it back, it is genuinely listened to and value. And it's the same in commercial. We talk about closed loop marketing all the time, and it's not closed. It's not even vaguely a loop. It's like they do the content, work out what data we can get from it, data comes back, and then the missing two bits of understanding and implementing is missing. And it's exactly the same in MedComms, right? What I think the true drivers, quite honestly, are agencies a lot of the time, because it's really important for them to learn, because they want to be the best in the field, right? So the data is really important to an agency who wants to excel in that space, and I'm sure all the agencies on this do it. But it almost by secondhand smoke, if you like, the clients will get the benefit of that. But agencies can't afford not to listen to data, because otherwise you're just gonna, I think James and Liz said this, you don't know what you're doing wrong, right? And I'm sure all of us, we're about to do this as agencies also once a year, maybe reach out to our clients, maybe through a third party, to interview them and ask them how they feel about the relationship, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. It's a horrible experience. What if you get back stuff that you don't like? Well, you can act on it. And if you don't do it and you don't know, then you can't act on it.
And that's the other side to metrics, of course, to just bring that back. So there's the metrics of the deliverables we produce and how we show up in the bigger world, but then there's also the metrics of how we show up to our partners. And I think that's increasingly something that clients are asking to see more, how we measure our own performance and how we benchmark that. But that's a whole different conversation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Like the simplest thing we can do is like just a quick pitch out there. James mentioned it, NPS, right? Just if there's anything you're doing, just try and tag on that. It's really and you do it over time, and you start to see if you've got trends. It's well established outside of our industry, but for good reason, right? It might seem odd when you've done a call with an insurance company to try and sort something out, and they get, would you recommend our services to someone else? But it's a really powerful metric and simple metric that if we're not doing anything else, at least we should be doing that at the end of a session. Sorry, Peter.
Okay, I'm guys. I mean, I think we've covered quite a lot of interesting ground there, and I think we've there's interesting food for thought there, but we have run out of time as always and gone over. So what I'm going to do for the purposes of today and the recording is say thank you very much. Huge thank you to you guys for coming on, and to the audience for joining in. Very clear message. I know you're all happy for me to say this. If anyone wants to follow up and talk to you directly, LinkedIn is the easy way of doing that. I will certainly make sure the references we talked about are going to be on that YouTube page and the other pages that I publish. But if you've got questions out in the audience, if you're watching the video and we haven't covered something, please do follow up. So members of the audience, you don't have to run away if you don't need to, because I like to have a few minutes at the end that's unrecorded. But huge thanks to you guys for joining in. If anyone wants to know more about what we're doing, medcomsnetworking.com, obviously, and I'm always happy to hear from anybody. So please do stay in touch. And in these really rather strange and uncertain times, stay safe, guys. But we're going to give you a wave now and stop the recording. So bye-bye. Take care. Bye.